So I first just wanted to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to speak today. I'm very excited to be here and to be able to contribute to this very important meeting. My talk today is going to focus on resilience. Resilience in, let me see, Danny, I'm going to switch to the microphone just because it's so hard to see over this. Okay, so resilience with respect to both mental and physical health outcomes among young people, adolescents who experience disadvantage. And so while I'm very aware that the specific the context that I'm going to talk about today is a specific American one, but the broader point that I wish to make here is that in every society, we have groups that experience disadvantage and mistreatment. And trying to understand how we get from a point of disadvantage to a point of resilience might illustrate some broader principles that could apply across societies, even if the specific samples that I'll talk about will be kind of very American in particular. And so in my case, I'm going to be talking about individuals who come from disadvantage, meaning they come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, so meaning they grow up, for example, under poverty. And also groups in the U.S. who tend to experience high levels of mistreatment. So in the U.S. context, one group in particular is Black Americans. So for example, if you ask Americans whether they've had an experience of being a victim of police violence, whether they've ever been denied housing that they could afford, whether they've ever been rejected from a job that they were qualified for, Black Americans are significantly more likely to endorse these experiences than are white Americans. Black Americans also have much lower earning potential than white Americans. So currently today, Black Americans earn about 60% of what white Americans earn. They also have much lower levels of wealth. So Black Americans have about 1/10 the wealth levels as white Americans do, as indicated by white Americans in the top blue here and Black Americans in the bottom in red here. Black Americans also experience differences or disparities in terms of mental health outcomes. So for example, in the case of substance abuse, while they're only slightly more likely to use substances like, for example, marijuana, they're significantly more likely to experience the negative consequences of substance use. So about 3.5 times as likely to be arrested for marijuana use, significantly more likely to die from drug overdose compared to white Americans. We see the same kinds of patterns if we look at physical health outcomes. So for example, cardiometabolic diseases, where we see that Black Americans are significantly more likely to have diabetes, so as indicated by the top line, Black Americans compared to the bottom light line, which are the white Americans, and also significantly more likely to die from heart disease compared to white Americans. So when we see patterns like this coming up over and over again, one of the things perhaps our mind goes to right away is the idea of resilience. So that is the idea of, can we identify individuals who, in spite of growing up under high levels of disadvantage, do experience good outcomes in life, so essentially don't follow the trend that would be expected for them. So achieve, for example, good mental health and good physical health in life. Because if we can identify, for example, a subgroup for whom some kind of naturally occurring factor or characteristic is associated with these good outcomes, then perhaps this would be the basis or foundations for developing an intervention where we could seek to promote this in others who experience similar kinds of disadvantage. And so in my talk today, I'm going to talk about one particular kind of resilience characteristic. You can think about resilience at a variety of different levels. I'm going to talk at the individual level, but you could think about family, community, neighborhood, school level potentially factors. And I'm going to talk about a psychological factor that is self-control. So self-control refers to the idea of the ability to manage one's emotions and behaviors in order to achieve long-term goals. People who are high on self-control tend to endorse items like, I think ahead about the consequences of my actions, I stick to what I'm doing until I'm finished. They don't endorse items like, I get frustrated, I give up quickly on difficult tasks. And so the idea here is that if individuals grow up in environments that are filled with dangers and temptations that could distract them from or take them off the tracks from their larger life goals, then perhaps if these individuals are able to have high levels of self-control, that this self-control will help kind of keep them on track for achieving the kind of positive life outcomes that they want in life. And self-control or self-regulation has certainly been the focus of much attention in the psychological literature. Americans tend to believe that if individuals have high levels of grit, of perseverance, of kind of diligence, kind of working hard, kind of good regulation of one's behaviors, then those are individuals who are likely to experience good outcomes in life. And in fact, there is a whole host of literature that shows associations between self-control and positive outcomes in life. But much of this literature on self-control is in the general population. And and one of the things that we think is important to understand is how do you understand what do associations of self-control with outcomes look like when we look specifically in populations that are marginalized? What do we see in terms of patterns so that we can be more specific about how we think about interventions. And also in terms of from potentially an intervention implication point of view, the work that Greg and I do in our research center is largely focused around adolescents, and this is again from a prevention focus, is that the idea is that we want to be thinking about factors that might be relevant where we could potentially intervene to prevent the onset of, for example, substance use disorders or chronic health conditions, in our case as well. So I'm going to be talking today about a series of studies conducted in adolescents who come from marginalized backgrounds, so in this case, meaning from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, and predominantly the samples are going to involve Black Americans. I'm going to show you outcomes related to both mental and physical health outcomes. Now, I'm not an addictions researcher, but I recognize that with the focus on this conference, what I'm going to try to do is make a point of illustrating these studies we have where we have looked at substance use outcomes. And what I'm not going to do is spend as much time talking about the physical health outcomes. Greg already gave a great overview of that. I'm just going to briefly say that our general approach when we think about adolescents, who are generally a very healthy sample, so you're not going to, for example, be seeing cardiovascular disease in adolescents. So the way that we approach thinking about physical health outcomes is that we look at biological risk markers that predict future chronic health conditions like cardiovascular disease or diabetes. Okay, what I'm going to do is show you some studies that we've done on self-control and mental and physical health in populations that have been marginalized. So in one of our earlier studies that we did on this, we recruited, this is together with Greg Miller and Jean Brody, we recruited a sample of Black adolescents where we had markers of the family's socioeconomic disadvantage. So this is whether the family lives below poverty levels, whether the parents are unemployed, whether the parents have less than a high school education. So we have indicators of family socioeconomic status. The adolescents are given a self-control questionnaire with items like the ones I showed you earlier. And then we measure both mental health outcomes, so in this case substance use in adolescents. So this was a composite reflecting smoking, alcohol use, and marijuana use, frequency of in the past month as a composite factor. And then for physical health outcomes, we have a marker of epigenetic aging. So this is an indicator of the essentially biological aging of immune cells as reflected by DNA methylation profiles. And it's essentially an indicator of a person's biological age relative to their chronological age. So individuals that have kind of faster or higher levels of epigenetic aging are at greater risk. These kinds of measures have been associated with higher risk for all-cause mortality, higher risk for mortality from a number of chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease and cancer. So we see it as a kind of example of a biological risk marker. So the question that we're looking at here are, what are the associations like with mental health outcomes and physical outcomes, and does it vary depending on the socioeconomic background that adolescents are coming from? So what we see is, with respect to our mental health outcomes, is we see an interaction effect which shows us that essentially associations with self-control are strongest when we look at that group of adolescents that experiences the greatest disadvantage, meaning the lowest socioeconomic status. So the way this graph is set up is substance use from that composite on the y-axis, so higher numbers indicate a greater frequency of substance use. On the x-axis is levels of self-control, going from low on the left to high on the right. And the different lines indicate different family socioeconomic status, from the green bar, from the blue bars being the highest socioeconomic status or less disadvantaged, to the green bar indicating the lowest socioeconomic status group or the most disadvantaged group. So what we see here is that the group in particular in which there appears to be the strongest benefits of self-control, or the strongest association between self-control and substance use, is the group of, and keep in mind these are all Black adolescents who come from the lowest socioeconomic status households. In this particular group, those who experience higher levels of self-control have lower levels of substance use. Whereas in contrast, Black adolescents who come from higher SES households, in those adolescents, self-control doesn't seem to matter as much. So we have a relatively flat line. Okay, so that's with respect to substance use. So what happens if we look at our physical health outcomes? So keep in mind here the way this graph looks. So we have this downward sloping line for our green line. What happens when we look at physical health outcomes? So interestingly, the green line completely flips. It's the complete opposite pattern. So this is for epigenetic aging. So now higher numbers indicate faster epigenetic aging or greater risk for cardiovascular disease, all-cause mortality. What we see here now is that now the group that appears to benefit from self-control in terms of a physical health outcome is the group of Black adolescents that comes from higher SES households. So this blue line here showing that if you're a Black adolescent and you grow up in a higher socioeconomic household, status household, here higher levels of self-control are associated with slower epigenetic aging, so better health outcomes. So this is what we would expect. This is what we see from a large self-control literature. Higher self-control typically is associated with better health outcomes. But what we see is that when we look at that most disadvantaged, most marginalized group, so Black adolescents who come from low SES households, here the pattern or the trend is the complete reverse. So now higher levels of self-control are associated with faster epigenetic aging or worse physical health outcomes for Black adolescents who come from low SES households. So when we first started to note this pattern, this was a little bit surprising to us, and we wondered whether this kind of pattern would be replicable or would be robust. And so we've done a series of studies since then to just try and test this question in a number of different ways. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of that. So in one study we did, we had the opportunity to test a similar kind of question in a sample of monozygotic twins. And so we fully recognize that all of the research that we do largely is observational because it's very difficult to manipulate socioeconomic disadvantage in humans. And so this means we know that there could be a variety of third variables that might explain associations that we're seeing in our studies. But the possibility of testing this question in a sample of monozygotic twins allows us to at least be able to control for genetic explanations and to conduct a study in a sample where the environmental conditions largely are quite similar across twins. So in this sample in adolescents, we had indicators of family socioeconomic status, a measure of self-control, which was a questionnaire measure of the personality trait conscientiousness, so the extent to which individuals are responsible, hardworking, they strive for achievement, they have good impulse control. And we had mental health outcomes, including depression, as well as problematic alcohol use. So this is the extent to which individuals are experiencing problems with friends, with family members at work, or with the legal system in terms of their drinking. And in terms of physical health, in this particular study, we had a biomarker of inflammation called C-reactive protein. So Greg talked a little bit about a lot about inflammation, but C-reactive protein being a biomarker that has been found to prospectively predict risk for cardiovascular disease and diabetes, for example. So again, here what we're looking at is what is the association of self-control with mental and physical health outcomes, and does it vary by socioeconomic status? So what we find in this twin study is that for mental health outcomes, there are main effects across all twins. So meaning that across all twins, those twins that have higher levels of conscientiousness have, in adulthood, have lower levels of depression. And similarly, those twins that have higher levels of consciousness are less likely to experience problematic alcohol use. So again, potential suggestive of benefits of high levels of self-control as one would expect. So if higher levels of self-control, you're showing fewer symptoms of depression, you're showing less problematic alcohol use. So again, as one might expect. But what happens when we look at our physical health outcomes, so C-reactive protein, here we find again another example of an interaction effect. So here we have on the y-axis CRP levels, so higher numbers indicate greater inflammation or is considered worse health. On our x-axis here, so this is a within twin analysis now. So the last slide I showed you effects that are across all twins. This is a within twin analysis. So here we have what we call a deviation of conscientiousness score. So this means the difference between twins in a twin pair in their conscientiousness score. So a low deviation means that you have a twin pair that where both twins report the same level of conscientiousness. A high deviation score means that you have a twin pair where the two twins are discordant or quite different in the levels of conscientiousness that they report. So what we find is that the associations of this conscientiousness measure with CRP differ depending on the socioeconomic background that adolescents grew up in. So for adolescents who grew up in under high family socioeconomic conditions, the dotted line here, as twin pairs become more discordant, so they greater differences in terms of their conscientiousness score, the twin with the higher conscientiousness score has lower levels of CRP. That's why it's a downward sloping, negative sloping line. So for twins that come from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, being higher than your sibling, than your twin sibling in conscientiousness, makes you more likely to have a lower CRP score or better physical health, less inflammation. In contrast, it's the complete opposite direction in twin pairs that grow up under low socioeconomic households. So here, the greater the difference between twins in their conscientiousness score, now the twin that has the higher conscientiousness score is more likely to have higher CRP values. So the twin with more conscientiousness, if they come from a lower SES household, having higher levels of conscientiousness, it's associated with worse physical health outcomes compared to your twin who grew up in the same household, same low SES circumstance, but had lower levels of conscientiousness. So similar kind of pattern to the last study that I showed you, now just showing it to you within twins as opposed to across the whole sample. Okay, so we also have other ways in which we've kind of indirectly defined high levels of self-control, which is that particularly in this sample that we have of Black adolescents, many of who are coming from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, making it to college is another kind of indicator of having high levels of self-control or striving. So that is, for many of these adolescents, their parents didn't go to college. If they make it to college, they're going to be the first in their family to go to college. And so that's another phenomenon that we think indicates high levels of striving and high levels of self-control. So we've used that as another way to just test this hypothesis in a different sort of way. So this is a different sample that we have, again, in collaboration with Greg Miller and Jean Brody, a different sample of Black adolescents recruited at the age of 11, where we had measures of the poverty levels in their neighborhood, And these adolescents were followed into young adulthood. So we were able to track whether the adolescent actually went to college or not as an indirect indicator of self-control. And we had measures in young adulthood then, so it's a longitudinal study looking over time, of substance use. So this was, again, a composite of smoking, alcohol use, and marijuana use, and a frequency score, again, over the past month. And then as a physical health indicator in this particular study, we had allostatic load, which is a multi-system indicator of physiological wear and tear on the body, again, predictive of cardiovascular disease and a number of chronic health conditions, and as measured by blood pressure levels, obesity levels, and stress hormones like cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. So here what we're asking is, again, the effect of our self-control indicator, in this case college attendance, on these mental and physical health outcomes. And what we see here is that with respect to substance use, we see a significant interaction effect. So again, higher numbers on the y-axis indicate a greater likelihood of using substances. The x-axis is our socioeconomic status measure, so it ranges from high socioeconomic status on the left-hand side to low socioeconomic status on the right-hand side. So on the left-hand side, high socioeconomic status as indicated by nobody in your neighborhood is living below poverty levels. On the right-hand side, we have what we consider low socioeconomic status neighborhoods. So, where you have over half the people, over 50% of the people in the neighborhood are living below poverty levels. And so what you see here is that, again, if our indirect indicator of self-control is whether adolescents make it to college or not, those who make it to college are, in theory, showing high levels of self-control. Here what we see is that for Black adolescents who grow up in high poverty neighborhoods, making it to college is associated with lower levels of substance use compared to Black adolescents who grow up in equally low-income neighborhoods but who don't make it to college. So again, a potential beneficial effect of making it to college or high levels of self-control. In contrast, when we look at Black adolescents who are coming from higher SES neighborhoods on the left-hand side, there's no difference between whether those who make it to college and those who do not in terms of their substance use level. Basically, substance use is low across the board. So this is very similar to the first study that I showed you, where the apparent benefits of self-control for substance use outcomes are apparent in that most marginalized group of Black adolescents who grow up in under the lowest economic circumstances. So what happens when we look at our physical health outcome? Keep in mind again here that the dotted line here above the solid line for substance use as an outcome, and we see here that it flips again completely when we look at our physical health outcome of allostatic load. So here on the y-axis, allostatic load, higher numbers indicate higher allostatic load or higher blood pressure, obesity levels, basically greater risk for a number of chronic diseases later in life. And so what we see here is that the apparent benefits of going to college or high levels of self-control are apparent in Black adolescents who grow up under higher socioeconomic status circumstances. So those who grow up in low poverty neighborhoods or higher SES neighborhoods here, if you make it as a Black adolescent, if you grow up in a higher SES family and you make it to college, as a young adult, you have significantly lower levels of allostatic load compared to the Black adolescents who don't make it to college. So again, this is the typical effect that we often expect to see when we think about the effects of college attendance. But in contrast, it's the complete opposite pattern when it comes to our most marginalized group, Black adolescents who grow up under the lowest socioeconomic circumstances. Here, if you're a Black adolescent who makes it to college, now you suddenly, as a young adult, have significantly higher levels of allostatic load compared to Black adolescents who are growing up in equally low socioeconomic circumstances, but you don't go to college. Great, thanks. So So the question is, so I have one last study. It's basic. I'm going to actually skip it and just talk about why it is. Just that the last study shows the same thing, another interaction pattern, but now with metabolic syndrome diagnosis, which is basically a constellation of risk factors for diabetes and heart disease. So the question that comes up then is, why? Why would we see such a differential pattern when it comes to mental health and physical health outcomes related to self-control in Black adolescents who are growing up with socioeconomic disadvantage? So this is a pattern that we've come to call skin deep resilience. And so the idea is that when it comes to more observable behaviors, so for example, substance use, that individuals who come from disadvantage but who have high levels of self-control, in this case, show positive outcomes. So they show good outcomes with respect to substance use, as I showed you today, but also in a series of studies we've done with respect to other, that I didn't show you today, with respect to other life outcomes. So they're more likely to earn higher levels of income, they have higher educational attainment. So essentially, we call this kind of phenomena, we call this above the skin because these tend to be kind of either behaviors or indicators that are observable to other people. But when we look below the skin, this is where we see, physiologically, this is where we see adolescents struggling. And they're struggling in ways that are invisible to themselves because it's about these physiological risk indicators like epigenetic aging and allostatic load, which they would have no idea what their levels are of. So it's a phenomenon that we've come to call skin deep resilience. Because it's about the idea that they're young people, that for these young people, they are looking good by a lot of external indicators. So in terms of substance use behaviors, in terms of income, educational attainment, they're looking good by these observable indicators. And so people are calling them resilient, but their resilience is only skin deep because if you look below the skin, they are actually struggling physiologically on a number of indicators. Okay, so why would this be? So we've argued that it's related to the costs of maintaining high levels of self-control over long periods of time. So that while exerting self-control may have benefits, such as in terms of substance use, that having to consistently maintain control over a period of years and years and years in order to achieve the outcomes that you want in life, that this is where having to effortfully maintain self-control can become exhausting and can start to take a toll on physical health. We argue that in particular, adolescents who experience high levels of disadvantage and marginalization are having to experience self-control that in a different kind of context than adolescents who come from more advantaged backgrounds. So for example, many of them are having to exhibit their high levels of self-control very independently. So perhaps they're striving to go to college, but they don't have parents who know what it means to get into college, to apply to college. Perhaps they're striving to go to college, but their neighborhood schools are very under-resourced, and they don't have advanced classes that help prepare them for colleges. They don't have college counselors that help explain the college process to them. And these are also individuals for whom, when they're trying to exhibit high levels of self-control, their mistakes can be costly. So as I showed you in one of the earlier slides, so if they experiment with drugs, for example, they might be way more likely to get arrested and experience harsh consequences. So the importance of never faltering in your self-control becomes even greater when you come from this kind of background. And so what we're arguing then is that it's not just that they're exerting self-control, it's that they're having to do so in environments that contain a lack of support, a lack of resources, and where the consequences are magnified, and that's why you're seeing a toll to physical health. So I know I'm out of time, so just to summarize, I'm finishing up right now, just to summarize, what we've been finding is that adolescents who come from backgrounds of disadvantage and who have high levels of self-control are showing good profiles in terms of substance use, but at the same time, these same individuals are showing poor profiles when it comes to physical health outcomes, and this is a phenomenon that we've come to call skin deep resilience. And we think this is important because we think it suggests that as we think about interventions to reduce and prevent substance use, particularly earlier in life in adolescence, if we think about the factors that we think are associated with high levels of self-control, we have to think about the possibility of what if we are targeting factors in which we're, at the same time that we might be benefiting substance use, inadvertently harming adolescents in other life domains. And I think that's the broader point that I want to end on, is just that we need to consider adolescents in a very holistic manner as we're thinking about what kinds of interventions we want to be doing. Thank you.